Hi everyone. This video is about the California Public Utilities Commission, also known as CPUC, Electric Rule 21 Interconnection Policy. Rule 21 is a tariff that describes the requirements for grid-connected generation facilities, like distributed energy resources, which are also referred to as DERs. DERs are generation devices that are located on the distribution lines. Residential and commercial scale PV inverters is an example of a DER. Specifically, Rule 21 pertains to the interconnection, operating, and metering requirements that the DERs are required to comply with. For a PV inverter company, this means that Rule 21 dictates what the grid-relevant parameters their inverters need to be set to in order to better support grid stability. This policy has been around for a while and recently underwent a change. In total, they're going to have 3 phases of changes. The first phase was enacted September of 2017. The first phase was autonomous functions. The functions that are now required are anti-islanding, low-high voltage ride-through, low-high frequency ride-through, dynamic volt-var operations, ramp rates, fixed power factor, reconnect by soft start methods, frequency watt, and volt watt. Phase 2 of Rule 21 is going to be the monitoring, and the implementation date is going to be determined in 2018. Phase 3 will be control, and that implementation date will be the following year in 2019. To talk about Phase 2 with monitoring, the Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which is IEEE Standard 2030.5, has been adopted for Phase 2 monitoring. However, the method for achieving this standard, which is what the lower protocols that actually communicate to the DER, is still being developed. With Phase 3, the monitoring and communication really needs to be in place before control could honestly be implemented. So the actual implementation date of Phase 2 will dictate when Phase 3 could potentially be implemented. Now that we've introduced what Rule 21 is, who needs to comply, and the basic outline of what has and is going to change, we are going to delve into what those smart inverter requirements in Phase 1 actually are. The first one mentioned was anti-islanding. Anti-islanding is a requirement for all DERs to ensure that there won't be an islanding event. To explain that a little more, if the inverter is in operation and the grid is removed, and the loads at the inverter terminals are equal to the inverter instantaneous production, then the inverter may remain in operation. This scenario is called islanding, and it is not desirable for lineman safety. Additionally, an islanding scenario could potentially damage customers' equipment in the event of an outage. Because of this, DER inverters have the intelligence to disconnect in the event of abnormal conditions at the site where they are installed. DERs alone cannot operate without a voltage source and disconnect according to the utility requirements to prevent an islanding event. The second requirement mentioned was low-high voltage ride-through setting. Now this has to be activated, just like the anti-islanding. Ride-through is referring to the ability of the DER to stay connected during a high or low voltage event for a predetermined voltage percent and duration of time. For Rule 21, the Phase 1 change, the high voltage percent hasn't changed, but the time to disconnect was extended. On the low voltage side, the low voltage percent and time to disconnect have both been altered. The intent with this setting is to prevent brief interruptions, and it's like 160 milliseconds, which could cause catastrophic cascading events. To explain that a little further, if you have more than 10% of PV penetration on your utility grid, and you have a slight voltage bump or voltage drop, then having all of that PV turn off instantaneously could cause a lot of stress on the generators that are connected to that vicinity, and could cause those generators to trip offline, which could potentially cause a cascading event where you get rolling blackouts over a long period of time. With this, the utility can predetermine the voltage percent, whether it's on the high or low side, and the time as to how long they figure these instantaneous dips or bumps could potentially last, and program the DERs to react in that manner. So they will stay connected, although not providing power, and wait that predetermined amount of time to see if the grid voltage stabilizes, and if it does, it remains connected and it continues to produce power at that point in time. This is to help prevent a cascading failure. The general disconnect time would be about 5 minutes, and being able to ride through low voltage bumps reduces potentially losing a significant amount of electricity generation for a longer period of time. This setting is low-high frequency ride-through, and similarly to the last two, this one has to be activated. This ride-through is referring to the ability of the DER to stay connected during high or low frequency events for a predetermined amount of time. The Rule 21 high-frequency tripping time, in comparison to what it used to be, has been shortened. However, the mid-range tripping time values have been extended. Similarly to the low and high voltage ride-through, the utility depicts the values that are predetermined for the location where it's going to be installed to ensure that the minor fluctuations that they've determined to be normal operation will not cause a large amount of DERs to immediately trip offline, and that they will stay connected for a predetermined amount of time to ensure that you don't have nuisance tripping with a high percentage of DERs dropping offline. This setting is the dynamic volt-var operations. This also has to be activated. In this instance, the grid voltage would depict the quantity of VARs that the inverter would inject or consume. This is particularly beneficial in locations with high DER penetration because it reduces voltage rise, which is associated with high DER penetration. By injecting or consuming VARs, the DER inverter is helping maintain the grid voltage quality. And looking at this in the long term, they're also allowing more DERs to be installed in that specific location, and are also reducing the potential of nuisance tripping that would be caused from high DER penetration. The next setting is ramp rates. Again, this has to be activated. This function defines how the DERs will turn on, because some DERs, PV most notably, can ramp up, which is a turn on, faster than traditional electrical generation. The Rule 21 requirement has reduced the ramp rate from 100% to 60%. to allow more time to ramp back on traditional generation as PV DERs are ramping up in the morning. And essentially what that means is that a PV inverter, the second that the sun is on the PV modules, it can turn on and immediately start producing power. And that instance, the utility, the power has to go somewhere, so the utility has to start turning their generators off to compensate for all that additional electrical generation that's being dumped onto the utility grid. And they can't do it that fast. So telling the inverters, no, we know you can go up to 100% immediately, but really we want you to go up incrementally, so you're really only going to start at 60%. It gives the utility more time to actively turn off their generators and help them better manage their loads. The next setting is fixed power factor. Unlike the ones that we have discussed thus far, this setting is deactivated. This functionality would require the DER inverter to continuously supply reactive power at a fixed power factor cosine phi. This would be beneficial in locations where the utility knew there were heavy loads that consumed VARs, but if it was not a location, then it could be reducing the output of the smart inverter and essentially injecting VARs where it wasn't necessary. This is ultimately deactivated because it's treating the cause, not the symptom, and it's either volt VAR or a fixed power factor. And the volt VAR function, which is only implemented when the voltage dictates so, is more valuable in regarding to maintaining grid stability. The next setting is reconnect by soft start methods. Like the majority of the other settings, this one has to be activated. In the event of a grid failure, this function requires the DERs to wait a predetermined amount of time before they're allowed to reconnect. On top of that, they're only allowed to reconnect incrementally. Whereas previously, kind of like when the sun comes up and sun hits the modules and the PV inverters start producing as much power as they can, this is similar to that. It only allows them to turn on incrementally to allow the grid to stabilize before slowly ramping up. And this is to prevent rapid changes from PV on the utility grid. The next functionality is frequency watt, also called FreqWatt. This functionality is actually optional. It's required to be activated when available. The reasoning is because not all DERs have the FreqWatt functionality. And to explain what the frequency watt function is this specific functionality reduce the power output of the DER inverter if the grid frequency was high. The reason behind this is a high frequency event is an indication that a traditional generator is being underutilized and is spinning faster than it's intended. By reducing the power output of the DER, it'll increase what is being consumed from the generator and slow the spinning down to the point where the frequency is where it is intended to be. This stabilizes the utility grid and does not overtax the generators connected to the grid. The next functionality, which is actually the last one, is the volt-watt functionality. Similar to the last ones we discussed, it is optional. Typically comes deactivated. This functionality would reduce the power output of the connected DER inverter if the grid voltage is high. And the reasoning, as we discussed before, is high voltage is associated with high DER penetration. So having the DER inverter reduce the power output would reduce how much voltage was being raised due to high DER penetration. And although this functionality could help stabilize the grid, it could also potentially mask high consumption areas. And without monitoring in place yet, that could potentially prevent the utility from knowing if their feeders were in need of upgrade. To summarize, with the increase of DER installations, to maintain growth, grid-relevant parameter settings for DERs need to evolve and work with the utility grid. Today, Phase 1 for Rule 21 is achieving the first step required to work towards sustainable growth. Phase 2 is going to expand on it by implementing monitoring so the utility will have better insight into what the DERs are producing to be able to match up what loads are actually being consumed on their distribution lines. From there, the next step in the evolution of the grid will be control, where the utility will be able to communicate with the DER and the DER will be able to communicate with the utility, ultimately achieving full sustainable growth and a stable grid. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions or feel that there is something that I could elaborate more on, please let me know. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.